What I'd like to do is just provide a brief overview of ARI's research mission, particularly focusing on selection and training, describe the key challenges and research interests in those areas. By giving some examples of what ARI does research in these areas, that might help set the context for the possibilities of what neuroscience might have to contribute. And I'll just sort of throw out the gauntlet to the neuroscience community about some things that the Army would need to consider in terms of criteria for looking at neuroscience contributions. Next slide, please. I thought I'd start with just sort of a brief outline of how the S&T labs are. This is not by no means a representation of every S&T lab. If some of you are out there and it's not up here, it's not intentional. I just wanted to give it a flavor for it. In the Army Materiel Command, there's the R&D Command, and there's the Human Research Engineering Division. If you're interested in neuroergonomics or the human-machine interface, that's the group that's responsible for that mission. There's been some talk about immersive and simulation technologies. The Simulation and Training Technology Center is the one that does that. If you're interested in wiring soldiers' helmets for neuroactivity, it would be the Natick Soldier Center that would do that. The Army Medical Command has the areas of physical and mental health and fitness, so areas of TBI, PTSD falls there. What I am going to talk about is the Army Research Institute. We report to the Deputy Chief of Staff G1. For those that aren't familiar with the Army, that's the Human Resources Policy person on the Army staff. And our areas of responsibility are in personnel, training, and leader development. Our organization is primarily psychologists. These are some of the representative areas: experimental, cognitive, social, and so forth. We do have our sampling of human factor psychologists. We have counseling and clinical psychologists, but our mission focus is in these areas. Next slide, please. Our major research goals is to help the Army meet its personnel mission and to develop effective methods for training soldiers and units and growing agile leaders. This is an overly simplistic diagram, but what the Army has to focus on is selecting the best that they can, assign them to appropriate jobs, and go through a process of training and leader development. And that process is not by any means linear as it's depicted on the slide here. The Army has a very rich and robust training and leader development program throughout a soldier's career in order to achieve the performance and outcomes that the Army values. The real challenge for the Army is that they have to access in very large numbers, well over 100,000 in this next year alone, be able to select the best of those, and there's always a balance between what you do as far as what you select on versus what you train. Next slide. So along that same lines, there's been some discussion today about nature versus nurture. And one of the ways you might look at it are what are the more stable attributes. Doesn't mean that these are just carved in stone and it's not possible to develop these further, but the stable attributes are the things that we would tend to look at that you might want to select on. Things in the higher order skills and the knowledge things are things that you can train and develop. We've kind of put these into two categories. On the far right, the knowledge domain, pretty much the methods to be able to domain-specific knowledge and acquire procedures and so forth is fairly well known. The area that ARI is particularly interested in is in the left column about being able to assess and measure individuals and be able to predict outcomes, and then the middle column, which is the higher order skills and attributes. As we go and talk about neuroscience, some of the questions that we have is what can neuroscience offer, and I'll say the left and the middle columns. And where I see a lot of the focus on, and rightly so because it's fairly nascent, is in the areas of domain-specific knowledge. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I'll just briefly overview, both in selection and the training arena, what the Army's currently doing, what are the research interests and some of ARI's focus, and what a challenge might be for a neuroscience application. So in enlisted selection, what you're looking for is to select on, as I mentioned, knowledge and skills, abilities, and aptitudes. And here's a sampling of the current measures that the Army uses in order to assess whether someone meets the standards for Army, for coming into the Army. There are physical fitness and medical exams. Of course, there are credentials and records. There was a mention, General Wallace talked about an emphasis on high school diploma. That is because that is a measure of whether an individual has the basic knowledge and skills that we expect. We can't start from ground zero. But there are also a percentage that can be taken in with alternative degrees like GED and homeschools. We also look at things like criminal history in order to try and get a handle on predicting future behaviors or issues. An area that ARI has worked in and has a rich history in is in the selection tests there at the bottom, the knowledge and analytical tests. And in fact, ARI began in the early 1900s with the psychologists that would develop the first tests that could be mass administered. The areas that are currently being used are language and math skills and also technical skills, and these are used in combination of deciding minimal entry standards as well as classification to different jobs. Okay, next slide, please. So what does the Army need in the area of selection? Well, currently, they do have good measures that predict trainability and attainment of knowledge and skills, but it doesn't account for all of the variance in job performance. And the current measures, particularly the analytical measures, are weak predictors of attitudes and attrition and career attention. The challenge for the Army is that there's a decreasing percentage of the population that meet the requirements, and General Wallace talked about this in his talk. There's a decreasing propensity to enlist. Maybe the declining economy might help the Army some in that. But in general, we still want to make sure that we're selecting the best. And there's issues of changing demographics as well. Is our instruments still tapping the population and assessing in the way that we need to? So areas of research interest are being able to assess cognitive potential. We talked about that high school diploma infers ability to learn because you had to have learned enough to be able to pass these tests on the math and verbal skills. But is it actually an accurate predictor of learnability, particularly if maybe English isn't your first language and there might be other challenges? We're interested in what is mental flexibility. How do you measure that? We're looking at temperament, issues of motivation, dependability, these other things that contribute to whole person performance. It's not just your analytical skills, it's also the soldier's skills in the areas of motivation. Actually, I was just talking about the whole person assessment. How do these different factors come together in order to have a good predictor? And while we do have a good classification system, Army jobs are changing. Skill requirements change, and we have to continue to evolve how we decide what soldiers are assigned to what jobs. Okay, next slide, please. So here's just two examples of areas that ARI is working in. In the area of mental flexibility, this is in our basic research program. It's being conducted in universities and with college students. And it's an extension of the work about what are the components, say, of intelligence, what is fluid intelligence, what is flexible thinking. Some of the things that we're looking at are tests that can measure ability to have flexible thinking skills. This is just only a small little example of a kind of item that's on a test that's being research conducted on. It's a counterfactual analogy. And so if you assume that the statement is true, toothbrushes are made of ice, and you're giving the analogy a tool and a toolbox, what would be the answer for the toothbrush? They said they had great minds here the other day. Is it? Okay, so it's freezer. And this, what it does in these tests is it switches. So this one would be novel and relevant. There are some things that are familiar and irrelevant, and it switches in the test. It's test your ability to move back and forth and be able to make these completions. The initial findings are really very interesting, and it looks like they're going to have reliability and construct validity, and we're going to continue to follow this line of research. And if it looks like the findings continue to hold up, then we would try it within a soldier population and see if they actually predict the outcomes that we're looking for. Another area that is really now maturing that ARI has been working in for some time is the area of measuring temperament. And this research actually started, I'd say, about 15, maybe almost 20 years ago, and it actually started with the Special Forces, who was interested in coming up with these kinds of measures for selection. And the research has matured to the point where I guess it's about 3 or 4 years ago, these measures are being used to determine of the non-high school diploma graduates, the ones with the GED holders, a percentage of them need to pass this test in order to be accessed in the Army, because our findings have shown that those that pass these measures have lower attrition. They drop out of the Army at a lower rate than those that don't pass these temperament measures. And an example of one of the instruments is you're given a question, which is a self-report. Which of these statements is most like you? So how many of you like roller coasters? All right. And how many enjoy parties? Okay. So now, being here at the Army, we're trying to figure out what is the right answer. Now, we're going to have to access about 100,000 new soldiers or more in this next year, so we might say both of those answers are right, and all of you are welcome to join. Actually, what it is there's no really right and wrong answer on these questions, and that's why they're constructed in this way. They're constructed, and they're called forced choice alternatives, so that they're both seemingly appealing, and both you can't say, well, this is a right answer, that's a wrong answer, I'm going to try to game it. We have to make sure that ours are faking resistant. What we do is we construct sort of a profile over a series of questions, and that when we have a computer adaptive test and it pairs them differently, and ends up coming up sort of a profile of the individual. And based on that, we have extensive data which shows we can predict soldier attrition, which I mentioned is being used to decide who to take in for the non-high school degree diploma graduates. And we're also looking at as how well it predicts discipline rates, soldier fitness, and prediction of training exam scores. And actually the data is very encouraging, and we're collecting more data this next year. And all the senior leadership has been briefed on this and is very interested. This may be the first major change to Army selection testing since probably the 1970s, and that's when the ASVAB was standardized for the analytical score. So we're very excited about this research. Next slide, please. So the question for the neuroscience community is, hopefully this gives you a little flavor of what the Army problem is and the magnitude of the sessions that we have to process. What would we be looking for, not only in neuroscience measures, but any measures in our arena? We have to pass the same level of scrutiny. So any measures have to be valid, they have to be reliable, and it has to be feasible. If you're taking in over 100,000 new soldiers through and testing them, it has to be cost effective. It has to be an efficient way to administer them, and it has to be practical. I'm also was glad to hear earlier this talk about this averaging in the means. The measures for selection have to be specific to the individual. There has to be a metric that's assigned, and that measure has to predict that individual's performance in training and these other kinds of measures. And that's without it passing these sort of capabilities, it's not going to make it into an Army selection test. All right, next slide, please. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the problem in training and leader development. As it was talked, I think it was most clearly articulated by the command sergeant majors yesterday. It's a tough environment at even lower and lower levels of leadership. Increasing levels of responsibility. This is just a smattering of the range of skills and knowledge that the soldiers need in order to operate in the contemporary environment. The methods that have used are a wide variety: instruction, demonstration, of course practice with feedback, mentoring, and so forth. General Wallace talked about the issue of trying to decide how much do you train live, how much do you train virtual, and what is the best blend between those. And then there's the question of measurement. How do you know that a soldier knows what he needs to know? And even more challenging is how do you know how well a unit is going to perform? Issues of collective measurement, unit measurement. Here's just a sampling of kinds of things that we use in order to measure your typical time accuracy for things that are amenable to time accuracy kinds of measures. The things that are more challenging to measure are things like leader behaviors and so forth, but there are methods that psychology has, and we've developed behavioral anchored rating scales and so forth. Subjective measures also are appropriate. Okay, next slide, please. So what are the challenges? The Army has, as I mentioned, the challenges, and I said that it was talked about yesterday, what the issues are. There's increasing and continually evolving training requirements. There's decreasing resources, and anticipating in times of the economy, there's probably going to be even less money that we're going to have to do with more. Time for training is crunched. With the size of the force that we have and the op-tempo that we have to very rapidly have soldiers acquire the skills that they need prior to deployment. This is just a sample of the huge list of issues that we're looking at in terms of training and leader development. The Army does a great job at basic combat training, but we are always looking to do better with methods of turning civilians into soldiers. It's not just the procedural skills, it's not just marksmanship, but what it means to become a soldier and incorporate Army values and ethics. I mentioned the issue of collective training and measurement, developing cross-cultural competence. How do you turn lessons learned that you learned in theater very quickly into new training methods? Design of virtual and game-based simulations. Just having a realistic environment does not mean it's an effective training environment. There's got to be methods and objectives in there that are incorporated into design. So as if you're working in the field of neuroscience, I'm saying this is the level of complexity and sophistication that the Army issues are at. Next slide. So two areas as highlights that ARI is working in is in flexible thinking skills. I mentioned we were looking at selecting in based on flexible thinking. We're also looking at developing those. And we had developed a method in order to capture the tacit knowledge of leaders that they have learned in theater, how to turn that into an effective training method, have collected empirical data, show that we can accelerate thinking skills. It's with a low-tech sequence of increasingly complex scenarios. It's not high-tech, it's not a hologram, and what do you know, it works. So based on the fact that it works, right now it's being incorporated in all of the TRADOC schools as a methodology for training adaptable thinking skills. Another area that we're particularly interested in, this was mentioned a little bit yesterday in a couple of talks, one on the when it was talked about machine understanding, the other about intelligent agents, is how do you take the knowledge of experts and put it into a simulated system, and more importantly from our point of view, we're interested in having intelligent coaches and mentors that are intelligent agents in these environments. So it's not just that you have a realistic avatar to interact with, but you actually have a virtual mentor or coach sort of over the shoulder that's helping the soldier as they go through these environments, collecting real-time dynamic data and being able to evaluate what they know and don't know, and then tailor that evolving scenario based on their skills and capabilities. We know from extensive research in the psychological realm that tailoring the training to the individual skills is the best way to accelerate training. Okay, next slide, please. So the neuroscience challenge is not unsimilar to how it was in selection, and it's the same for our world as well. We can't roll out a new method for the Army. They're not going to incorporate and adopt it unless we've shown that it's valid. It trains what it's supposed to train, it's reliable, and that it's an effective method, it's practical to employ. So the neuroscience world would need to be looking at how do you do methods and measures to develop psychomotor skills, situation understanding, and so forth to come up with the outcomes. Next slide, please. So, is it an unhappy marriage between neuroscience and behavioral science? I'd say no, they're both. However, in our perspective, what is the best evidence of expert behavior is performance. If you don't have performance, then what you uncover through the neuroscience measures is frankly, it's not going to mean anything. It has to mean something through exhibited behavior. So if you're looking at, if you have a hypothesis that that experts are more cognitively efficient, you can do that by behavioral methods, by doing secondary task performance and seeing decrements on that. Or you can also look at corroborating evidence in neuroscience, which in fact may support your hypothesis. Okay, next slide. Basically, this is something that those in psychology and the learning science have seen. From what I've seen so far, the neuroscientists tend to focus on, I'll call it the building blocks, the knowledge, the basic memory. From our perspective, we're really interested in the higher order cognitive skills. Next slide. These are just a smattering of some of the areas that we're working in our basic research program. We are interested in advancing theories. It's not all applied. I started with the applied examples to let you know everything we do in the basic research is with an applied transition focus. And areas that we work in, you can see there. We're also beginning to expand more into organizational behavior and network science aspects, because human behavior is not just about the individual alone, but it's also the units and organizations and dealing with non-government organizations and complex populations. Okay, next slide. So I thought I'd end with this slide, because while there may be a perspective that the behavioral sciences is stuck in the 1900s and we haven't moved and progressed at all. This is just a smattering of the last several decades, and these are major paradigm shifts that have occurred in psychology. Some of it have been driven by research and findings within the psychological investigations, and some of it's been influenced by industry, things in culture and society. And each one of them are all kind of mapped along to where the challenges have been for the Army and how it has served the Army well within these different points in time. So let's, and also police psychologists, I know I've oversimplified it, but just for example, I know behaviorism didn't start in the 1950s, but let's just start at that point in time and say in the 1950s, maybe the predominant paradigm was behaviorism, where you're learning through repetition and reinforcement. And so there was drill and practice. A lot of what the influence there was what was going on in manufacturing. That's where you had your psychologists looking at your time and efficiency expertise and try to this is your Lean Six Sigma time period, where you're just getting the existing method and process and the most efficient method that you can. This served the Army well during times of conventional warfare. You knew where your enemy was, you were at opposite lines, and you had a sort of rules of engagement that you followed. In the school system, it was those that were in it then, you remember, it was multiplication tables, and it was learning languages by memorizing, verb conjugations. Then began more of a shift towards cognitivism, learning as an information management process. Psychology was heavily influenced by what was going on in the computer science world. Human memory must be more like, storage in a computer, and memory capacity must be like RAM and processing. And there was a lot of synergy back and forth between computer science and psychology, and how we thought our thinking about human learning. That got evidenced in strategies by more cognitive analysis in structured learning. In the Army, the focus became on military decision-making models, where you had alternatives that you very clearly laid out, and you went into your depth and your breadth kind of trees, and you figured out what your... And it was suited for the times, which was more Cold War. I call it chess moves. You're going to move your missile silos here, and you're going to test your boundaries with your flyovers, and you had time to enumerate all these alternatives. Then, of course, then shifted a little bit more to guerrilla warfare, and technology and networks came about. And in psychology, the focus began to be more on that you learn by active construction of knowledge. We aren't just going to sit here and listen to a sage on the stage. We want to be actively involved. And in the school system, it changed more. They became into role-playing. It wasn't about just standing and memorizing. They wanted to do language learning by immersion. You just walk into class one day and you're just supposed to start speaking Spanish, and it's not about practicing your verb conjugations. In the Army, the focus then shifted, and it was more on, gee, we want to train as we fight. And this is when the combat training centers came out. This is when after action reviews, as that began to shift more into networked systems, then the online collaborations began to occur. So again, one didn't necessarily precede the other, which came first, the chicken or the egg. They fed each other. Now where we are in, I'll call it a blend, I think where the Army is struggling now, and psychology too, is, gee, we're not throwing out behaviorism, we're not throwing out cognitivism and constructivism. There's pieces, there's still the crawl, walk, run that needs to be done to get the basic skill acquisition. But what's the best blend of these to get the most accelerated learning? And then I think the most interesting part is going to be what's in the future. And some of this was touched on a little bit by Dr. Kurzweil and others here. I'm kind of presenting it here as two sort of basic, possibly antithetical views. You could have the biopsychosocial model, which is arising a lot out of the medical world and influencing us as well, where you're looking at the health and well-being of an individual, not just strictly from a Western medical model, but there's an emotional aspect and a social aspect to health and well-being. And the same sort of integrated look is going on in psychology as well. You're seeing much more integration between those that are working in the cognitive realm and the social psychological realm. We're interested in the role of what does emotion play in decision making. We're not all Dr. Spock. There's an interaction going on there. On the other hand, there's the community that's looking at how to augment cognition through artificial means, how you would have this synergy between humans and robotic elements, and that you then perform as one. I just coined the term cyber psychology. I have no idea what it will end up evolving to be. What remains to be determined, and I think these two thrusts are going to continue to move forward, is whether those two thrusts end up coming together. Is it going to end up being that the humanistic psychologists are going to have a backlash against those that are saying, no more artificial, I don't want an implant. I don't want, to be plugged into machines anymore. They're going to unplug themselves. Is it going to be the green humanistic movement, that's going to be on one side, and the AI, plugged in universe on the other, or are they going to come into some kind of happy marriage? I mean, somewhere in there's still got to be consideration of what is uniquely human, the aspects of love, hope, fear, stress. It's not just, machines aren't going to solve all of that for us. So we look forward in the domain of psychology, as well as the rest of the disciplines, to see how these will come together in the future in order to help not only improve human performance, but enhance and enrich our lives. As a summary, these are the kinds of things that psychologists think about, and these are the things that, and particularly Army psychologists, think about. You see a lot in this conference about the soldier as a system. We think of the soldier as a human, and like to take into consideration from the time they enter into the Army through that leader and development experience, family support. General Wallace said, gee, we would like to have an antiseptic war. We'd like to be able to not to have to be involved. I mean, like in the complex environments that we're in, but we anticipate that we will be. So like the picture in the lower left-hand corner, this is the environment we're going to be in, and technology helps. It helps for get information, but soldiers are going to need to have interpersonal skills. They're going to need to understand how to work within these environments, not only with the local populace, but how to work together as teams within their own units, within their own commands, and with non-government organizations and so forth. And this is going to be the big challenge for the Army, and we look forward with anticipation and doing what we can from the behavioral and social sciences to help the Army meet that mission. Thank you.